All right, again, good morning, everyone from the BVI, and good day on whatever part of the world you are at this time. Thank you again for joining BVI Finance's Taxing Times Roundtable Discussion 3. I'm Adriana Salverall, Marketing and Media Relations Coordinator of BVI Finance. The last discussion focused on the status of the OECD's plans to introduce a global minimum tax rate of 15% this year, 2023, otherwise known as Pillar 2. Today's discussion will focus on the status of the global implementation of the OECD's Global Minimum Tax Pillar 2. And this is a timely update as more countries, such as Switzerland and the Bahamas, develop plans to implement this 15% corporate tax. The discussion will include views from leading tax and finance experts, and we will once again be moderated by Oliver Cooper, Counsel of IFC Forum and Policy Lead at Charles Russell Speechlys LLP. Before I turn you over to Oliver, I'm just going to introduce our lovely panel. Starting with Oliver, he's the policy lead at Charles Russell Speechlys, an international law firm based in London. He advises a range of clients on international regulatory matters such as corporate transparency, information exchange, and the EU and OECD blacklisting processes. He acts as counsel to the IFC Forum, a trade body for intermediaries in the British Overseas Territories and Crown Dependencies that includes several BVI Finance members among its own membership. Away from his day job, Oliver also has extensive experience in both UK and EU politics. Kayla Laidlaw is a tax advisory director for Deloitte BVI and is focused on assisting clients across the Caribbean region with meeting their global tax transparency and information reporting obligations. Kayla has been with Deloitte for over 12 years and leads the delivery of Deloitte's FATCA, Common Reporting Standards CRS, and BEPS, and economic substance service offerings in the BVI, the Cayman Islands, and Bermuda. She also has assisted with the implementation of regulatory reporting portals and the related administration and oversight processes for various tax authorities in the region. Minnie Hurstveld. Professor Hurstveld has a background in international taxation and cross-border M&A from her years in practice and in tax policy from her work as a contributing editor at Tax Notes International. She has taught International Tax 1 and 2 and tax policy to both JD and LLM students. She has also developed a course, the first of its kind, in artificial intelligence and taxation. Professor Hurstveld is an author in International Taxation in a Nutshell 12th edition, a popular text for new students of international taxation. She has been a contributing editor to Tax Notes International since 2014, where she has written over 250 articles on international tax policy developments and cross-border transactions, and also has written extensive on U.S. tax reform efforts. Jeff Cook is an experienced chair and non-executive director. He has led significant business enterprises for more than 3 decades and helped major international groups to grow and prosper. As a charter director, Jeff has deep knowledge of corporate governance, global regulation, and risk management. He has authored numerous articles and papers on cross-border investment and the role of international finance centers in the global financial system. Jeff is a non-executive director to a select number of family office, private capital, and advisory boards. He was appointed chair of Morant Regulatory Consulting in 2021. Jeff is also a board member of Apex F Jersey Limited, a leading fiduciary, and is presently chair of the Society of Trustee and Estate Practitioners, or STEP, Global Public Policy Committee. He is formerly the CEO of Jersey Finance and the head of Wealth Management, HSBC, and has extensive international cross-border experience across various sectors. And last but not least, Pascal Santomont. Prior to joining Brunswick, Pascal was director of the Center for Tax Policy and Administration at the OECD, where working with G20 countries, he led the international tax policy reform. including ending bank secrecy or updating the rules for the taxation of multinational enterprises, known as the BEPS project. Pascal supported countries in designing their tax policies and providing technical assistance to developing countries. He launched the Tax Inspectors Without Borders initiative. Pascal graduated from the National School of Administration in 1996 and was an official in the French Ministry for Finance for nearly a decade. He held various positions within the Treasury. He is also a member of the UN Group of Experts of International Cooperation in Tax Matters, becoming repertoire in 2006. So now I'm going to hand you over to Oliver. Be sure if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A box and Oliver will get to them. And have a great session, guys.
Great, thank you very much, Adriana, and to everyone participating today. It's going to be a great panel. As Adriana said, if anyone has any questions at any point, do pop them in the box. I'll try to pose them in as piercing a way as possible to our panel. But I'll start actually with Pascal, where we left off the introductions, because of the 8 billion people on Earth, he's the one most intimately related and associated with these reforms. So Pascal, having spent many years to work on it, has Pillar 2 now reached a critical mass? Did you leave the OECD feeling job done, or are there still roadblocks in the way going forwards?
Thanks, Oliver, and good morning, afternoon, evening, whatsoever to the audience. Your question relates to Pillar 2 and Pillar 2 only, which makes my answer plainer and simpler. The answer is yes, job done, because Pillar 2, or at least the globe rules, because the STTR is on its way. You know that Pillar 2 is made of 2 different components. One component is the globe rules, so the global minimum tax of 15% effective. And the other component is the subject to tax rule, which made significant progress as it was released last week and endorsed by the G20 finance ministers, with the model MLI and all the instruments, as well as the commitment to deliver the STTR to developing countries. Now, why do I say a plain yes? Not because all the countries would have implemented. We all know, and we'll come back to that later, Mindy definitely will, that the United States of America, in spite of being the country which initiated the principle of a global minimum tax, with guilty back with the Tax Cut and Job Act at the end of 2017, the US introduced the idea of minimum tax, but the US did not implement, failed to implement would be more accurate, the globe rules. In spite of these being the priority of President Biden, there was no majority in the Senate to get it done. China is not implementing Pillar 2. So people may say, I mean, what on earth is this guy talking about, as the 2 largest economies have not implemented the minimum tax. But the way this global minimum tax was conceived, engineered by my team, then my team, is that it's enough of having a critical mass of countries for it to have an impact. And I think we can say that today there is a critical mass of countries implementing the globe rules, which are these countries. The European Union, they have until the end of the year to translate the directive into domestic legislation, but as of 1st of January 2024, there will be an income inclusion rule hitting EU companies which may have pockets of profit tax below 15% in foreign jurisdictions. You have Japan, you have Korea, you have Canada, you have the UK, which means the G7 plus the European Union minus the US. And all these countries enacted under tax payment rules, which means that for American companies or Chinese companies or companies not implementing, there will be, starting in 2025, there may be a 1-year buyout there, waiting for the next US tax reform, which will take place then. But these companies, which will not be subject to an income inclusion rule, will have to face another tax payment rule, which means that when you have a critical mass of countries in terms of companies incorporated, in scope companies incorporated, as well as in market, you have a full impact, which is why and I will stop with that, that a number of low tax jurisdictions, and I think in your introduction, you referred to the Bahamas or Bermuda, low tax jurisdictions. I would include Switzerland, I would include Singapore, I would include the United Arab Emirates, have decided to move towards implementing a qualified determined minimum top-up tax, or to introduce corporate income tax, as is the case with the United Arab Emirates. So has the tax world changed? Yes, it has significantly. It's being implemented. There are tremendous challenges in terms of collection of the information, in terms of compliance cost, which is true. But the roadmap fixed by G20 leaders and other politicians, I think, has been implemented with a quite unique agreement, bringing more than 130 countries to agree this move. So the answer is yes. And in this new world, I think there are some challenges for countries, for jurisdictions like the BVI, which is specialized in incorporating companies. What's the impact? It's not easy. The estimates by the IMF, the OECD, and others that there is more than 200 billion euros at stake of additional revenue per year. I think there is some form of consensus on the figure, but there is a big uncertainty on who's going to grab the money. Is it the low tax jurisdictions, which after all will be at 15% minus the carve out, minus maybe some subsidies or some qualified tax credit, but that's not an easy game to play. So will they keep the business and take the money, or will the business move, or do you have a dynamic where existing business may stay but new business may not come? Open question that you may have the answer better than I would, and I think it's time for such jurisdictions and business in these jurisdictions to think very carefully what the next step is.
Great, thank you. Just quickly, Jeffrey Kirk's asked the question, so what is the position of the other BRIC states in implementing it? I think just factually, so South Africa has said they're going to implement it, but otherwise the other BRIC economies are not going to be. Your argument, Pascal, doesn't really matter. It's reached the critical mass and the incentives.
It doesn't impact really the critical mass. I mean, China hasn't moved, and I don't think they will move. At least when this was negotiated, it was clear that China didn't intend to move. But after all, once all the countries have moved, you have a strong incentive to move. So there is a first mover advantage in a sense, but which incentivizes the others to move. Now, emerging economies are not in a big hurry because they are not countries of residence of MNEs. They're market economies, right? Brazil may have a few in-scope companies, not that many. South Africa has very few in-scope companies. India has more, and we are left with Indonesia. Indonesia, by the way, already announced that they're going to move. The others, I trust, will move. I think Brazil is in the process of, but as they are not income inclusion countries, it's more about the under tax payment rule, which gives them some more time to move. I think because of the conversation of Pillar 1, they kind of made a question of principle to link the two pillars, which are not linked other than politically, if you want, but technically they are two completely different animals. And even India, I mean, when you talk to Indian practitioners, they don't really understand why India says, no, we make the link between the two pillars. I think they make the link because they're not in a hurry to implement the income inclusion rule, but rather focus on the under tax payment rule. I think the BRICS are going to move, so will developing countries. The question that people don't have in mind, which I think is even more important, is how African countries or Latin American countries or even Asian countries which have tax holidays are going to move, because that's where you have big stakes. If you have massive tax incentives, which is the case in so many countries, and the IMF and the OECD, when I was there, I think they haven't changed since I left, consider that most of these tax incentives are wasteful tax incentives in terms of attracting new investments or in the overall stock of investment, these countries will have to decide what they do. Do they do a QDMTT or do they let other countries tax? And you saw probably some conversation on what Vietnam, under the pressure of a Korean company, said that, okay, they will collect it and hand it back. And I think that's a real question, which may be more critical than the BRICS, which have probably fewer tax holidays than pure developing countries.
Great, thank you, Pascal. I think at that point, maybe could we turn to Mindy, because the big exception to all that in terms of progress and pressure is the United States. And it's fair to say the Republicans in the US have really made it, opposing this, an article of faith of their party platform now. But in light of those recent developments internationally and in Washington, how do you, I guess, foresee the US's stance on global minimum tax evolving going forwards?
Yeah, thank you, Oliver. And I guess I would dispute the premise of your question. And also, I think the landscape is a lot more nuanced than Pascal characterized it as kind of, where he started job done and the US failed. So in order to say job done, victory declared, I think you have to have clear objectives. And I think the objectives of Pillar 2 have never been clearly enunciated, and what they are and what it means to for that job to be done. Since there are no clear objectives, how one could consider a job done is a big question mark to me. And as for the narrative about the U.S. failing and the U.S. being an obstacle in implementing a global minimum tax, well, as Pascal did point out, the U.S. was a first mover in adopting a global minimum tax. That's the GILTI tax, and there is no reason why the U.S. version of a global minimum tax and Pillar 2 GLOBE rules could not coexist. In fact, we have that model working effectively in the case of FATCA and CRS, and so this idea that the U.S. is standing in the way or preventing an overall adoption or effective adoption of a global minimum tax, I think is just false, and I'm sorry that it's so pervasive. Oliver, on your point about whether the Republicans are obstructionist in preventing U.S. adoption of a global minimum tax, I think that's not really an accurate narrative either, as you mentioned earlier in our private conversation before we started. I did testify last week. The Ways and Means held a hearing on Ways and Means Committee of the House of Representatives held a hearing on the OECD minimum tax. And one of the things, and although the hearing was led by the Republicans who are in the majority in the House of Representatives, and so many of the most pointed questions directed at a U.S. Treasury official who was testifying were very critical. What struck me about that hearing was the lack of strong support by the Democratic members who were asking questions for the OECD version of a Pillar minimum tax, a Pillar 2 minimum tax, and so the idea that the U.S. political landscape is divided in such a way that the Republicans are standing in the way, whereas the Republicans have, whereas the Democrats are fully supportive, I think is not an accurate narrative either. And then to the point about, well, the U.S. failed to implement the Pillar 2 because of the U.S. Senate. I think that's also not entirely, that's not really accurate either, although there were some changes proposed by the Biden administration to the existing U.S. rules. And some of those changes, but not all of them, were included in a version of legislation that passed the House of Representatives, but not the Senate. Those changes in no way would have resulted in full adoption of the GLOBE version of a global minimum tax into U.S. law. And so I think the landscape, both globally and with regard to Pillar 2 and U.S. global minimum tax and other U.S. minimum taxes, including the new corporate alternative minimum tax, is a lot more complex and nuanced. And just a couple of points on circling back to that job done point and what the new landscape is. So in connection with this hearing last week, at the Ways and Means Committee, the Joint Committee on Taxation, which is a bipartisan congressional committee that has many economists on staff, put out an extensive report on the global minimum tax. I urge people to read it. That report has a lot of economic data on U.S. companies' behavior from U.S. tax returns, but it also summarizes a lot of the economic research, modeling on the impacts of global minimum tax, and some of those summaries are of particular interest to low tax jurisdictions, and that includes the discussion of the way the substance-based income exclusion works and how low tax jurisdictions might be able to utilize that exclusion in order to attract real activity, and also the complex interaction between the qualified domestic minimum tax and tax incentives and qualifying tax incentives and not. And I think the one of their sentences there is that is particularly relevant to this audience, where they say, even though Pillar 2 may reduce base erosion and profit shifting, Pillar 2 may also increase tax competition over other taxes.
Great, thank you. I could turn back to you just on the, I guess, maybe prognosis, crystal ball gazing going forwards. I note your remarks that it's not exclusively a party political sort of battle line being drawn. Do things turn on the election result next year? I mean, the House Republicans have introduced proposed countermeasures against jurisdictions implementing UTPR. Is that a risk of that becoming law if there were a Republican trifecta? Or conversely, is that overblown as well?
Yeah, thank you, Oliver. I think nobody, I think even the lawmakers who introduced the retaliatory provision want to see that becoming law. Nobody thinks that a tit for tat on penalties being introduced on other countries is a positive, would be a positive development. I think that a more promising development would be for the OECD and its role as a kind of negotiating broker, and other countries are more sensitive to the balance of powers in the U.S. and I think it's unfortunate that Treasury seems to have negotiated a bill that would not pass Congress, and so I think if Congress, if the effect of those measures being introduced results in a multilateral process that better incorporates congressional viewpoints, and we're all better off.
Great, thanks very much for that. I might turn to Jeff, I guess, at that point. So countries like IFCs that are, and also the midshore jurisdictions, some of which have implemented IARs so far. So what should they be doing? How should they react and adjust to these changes? Obviously, you're sat in Jersey, but have experience across other centres, including BVI. What should those governments be doing in response to it?
It will more have a presence in most of those jurisdictions, both midshore and offshore. So I think there are a number of framing thoughts that would guide how you would approach this. And I think the first and most important one is membership of the inclusive framework. So if you go back quite a long way, our kind of world had very little access or very little voice in the determination of these kind of policy initiatives. And I think the Global Forum and then the follow-on inclusive framework changed that quite substantially. Of course, in an OECD fora, your major funder is going to have a bigger voice, but at least you get some voice, you get some ability to participate in the policy discussions. And if I may say so, not to flatter him, Pascal was largely responsible for that. And in the years of working with him and contact on and off, I think that has been held as a principle of fairness and sort of equity. And that's built a lot of confidence, I think, in the smaller jurisdictions, particularly offshore, midshore, about their voice being registered. And the OECD being something of a safe harbor against discrimination. So, if 138 countries, which I think was the count on the outcome statement on the 15th of July, 138 countries are saying that they're backing this initiative. Still detailed to be worked through on Pillar 1 and perhaps more on the STTR, but the basic principle of supporting a global minimum tax is supported by those countries. And the safe harbor for smaller jurisdictions who specialize in cross-border business is to meet and to support international standards. Because if you do that, it's quite hard to be discriminated against, or at least somebody's got to have some very substantive justification to say, we don't like what you're doing, so we're going to do this to you or that to you in terms of things like listing. So I think that's the most important starting point because of the very nature of the jurisdictions. After that, I think you've got to think about what your level of participation is. So I think participation's a given, but at what level and in what way do you participate? And then I think things start to vary by circumstances, by history, by predominance of business line, by geographical location, by relationships. So if I can use the example of the British Crown dependencies, they're in a different position to the British Overseas Territories and probably to some other jurisdictions around the world too. Who some would try and do similar kinds of work within the European Union and others in Asia and the Middle East. But their starting point is to have broadly conventional tax systems. When I use the term conventional, I mean that look like large country taxation, at least in their shape and form. The rates might not be the same, but they've got a broadly distributed tax base. You know, they'll have corporation tax, which has been around a long time. So if your starting point is that you already recognize the framework that's been built and you've already got it in place, but you're being asked to do something which, although it's radical in terms of the extraterritoriality, it still looks a lot like a corporation tax system. So in the three Crown dependencies, you've got a 0-10 system, 0% for trading companies, 10% for regulated financial services businesses. All this requires is to bring in a third tier for companies within scope at 15%. So it's actually not that difficult. And the tax administrations have the capacity, I think, and the knowledge and the expertise to do that because they've been doing it for a very long time, probably six decades or more. If you don't run a big country conventional tax system because that doesn't support your economy well, and that is the case in a number of jurisdictions, particularly in the Caribbean, the BVI and others, then trying to meet this requirement and participate through the income inclusion rule is a lot more difficult because you don't have the resources, you don't have the history, you don't have the expertise or experience or capacity. And in small jurisdictions to build all of that is complicated if you can get the talent to start with. It's also extremely expensive. And you don't have the broad conventional tax base to spread that cost across. So in terms of how if I was advising different people in these kind of different situations, I would be saying that your participation level needs to reflect your circumstances and your economic self-interest to a degree. And the UTPR, facilitating the UTPR and ensuring you're supporting the program and not putting any blockages in the way of the program so that those who do wish to tax can do so, and you're collaborating and helping them with their ability to tax is probably the best route. Because you then don't have to upend your tax system, turn it on its head, but you can be up with the program, you can be participating, and you can be contributing to the success of this program. Why does that make sense for these kinds of jurisdictions? Well, they're small politically, they don't have huge political clout. And there is a danger that they'll be discriminated against if they aren't seen as a proactive, cooperative member of the global tax family, the global tax system. And this gives them an opportunity to do that. And also, I think, perhaps eradicate some of the concerns there are around profit shifting and multinational groups managing to engineer a lower effective tax rate through the use of these jurisdictions. Because I don't think that's fundamentally what they're about as their offer. Their proposition principally is to provide tax neutrality. And the aim of that is not to avoid people paying legitimate tax. It's just to make sure that the tax is paid to the right people at the right time, which generally isn't the jurisdiction hosting the business. And I think that's been solved largely through transparency measures, through the CRS. FATCA, forgive me, Mindy, I'm not such a big a fan of, because it's a bit of a one-way street. But it still contributes. It still contributes to transparency, and it was a big lever in something that Pascal, I think, legitimately claims credit for, which is the end of bank secrecy and the concerns about people harboring, US citizens in other parts of the world and helping them kind of hide their money. So, I think it's not straightforward. It's not a straightforward sort of simple decision about which route you go, but I think participation is a simple decision, and it's the best decision for the bulk of the centres that we've described. People like Hong Kong and Singapore and the UAE, they're in a slightly different place because they have more political clout. They're quite important entrepôts. Their relationships are important. Hong Kong increasingly now, not just as a sort of a free port and sort of a bastion of free market enterprise, but because of its relationship to China. It is part of China. Singapore, is a kind of shining star of Southeast Asia, very, very important regional centre. And the UAE, was flirting with a corporation tax long before the global tax initiative, and I think this has helped them get that over the line. Actually, it's been quite helpful to those in the GCC that want to introduce conventional corporation tax. So that would be my framing of the situation, and I think although it's going to be costly and disruptive, and for small jurisdictions quite challenging, if it nails to the mass this lingering concern that centres like this are aiding and abetting tax evasion or aiding and abetting abusive tax practices, if it nails that to the mass and kind of kills it off, I think that would be a very good outcome. Okay.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. I think we're going to pick that up in a sec, but first I'm going to turn to Kayla, wrapping up the first comments. Just what you perceive the most significant implications for multinational corporations, not the governments, but the multinational corporations on global minimum tax, and how they should be changing their strategies in response to that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Oliver. I think there are two main implications that I would see, and I'm going to start with the very obvious one, which would be a likely increase in the total tax expense globally that these multinationals are going to have to pay, and the resulting decrease in net profit at the group level, which will have knock-on effects or could have knock-on effects for shareholder returns, reinvestment, among other things. That's the top of mind concern for our global clients. But I also don't think that we can underestimate the administrative and compliance burden and that's the piece that I think a lot of these groups can start getting ahead of now. So just like there will be significant investment and time spent at the government level, significant additional time and effort will also be needed at the multinational level to not only complete the required calculations, which can be quite complex, and I tend to defer those to our US colleagues, but also to track the group's obligations and top-up taxes owing in each jurisdiction. So I think we've heard a little bit about the varying approaches that are taken globally. So that will make it particularly difficult, especially in the early years, because Pillar 2 does not need to be implemented as a package, and each jurisdiction can essentially decide which measures it wishes to implement and when, for example, only the IIR or only a QDMTT. And those rules will work together, but it will actually be quite a significant compliance effort to start tracking those interactions, tracking the resulting implications, particularly for those groups that have operations across a number of jurisdictions. So we did see a similar tracking effort required for CBCR requirements when those came out in sort of 2017, 2018, but for Pillar 2, this will just be much more complex. And for this reason, we are seeing a lot of groups already working on implementing systems that will help both with those calculations and the various complex exclusions, but also the tracking of obligations across jurisdictions and really figuring out at the end of the day who you need to pay. And that will obviously need to remain flexible as the requirements evolve.
Great, thanks. And just on that, Kayla, do you think that will change or impact the demand there is for structures going through IFCs? Do they have to rethink the consequences for their economic models overall?
So we haven't seen a particular rush out of IFCs. I think there's still rationale to structure through there. What we have seen is just a broader rationalization of corporate structures. So do you really need this many entities? Do you need hundreds of entities in your group, or did some of those just exist because of historic tendencies to create a company each time you're undertaking a transaction? So that actually started, that sort of rationalization and maybe restructuring started with CBCR. We also saw it with economic substance when entities and groups were required to actually look at what each entity was doing. So I don't think it's specific to IFCs, but I do think we've seen just a general trend to rationalization of group structures and maybe slight simplification of global operations.
Great, thanks for that. Everyone, keep the questions coming in the Q&A box. We've got a few that have come in. We're going to answer. I'm going to turn to Pascal because you only got him for about 20 more minutes, and I'm going to abuse that time of making it mostly about him. Do you agree, I suppose, with Jeff's comments about seeing this as a mechanism by which maybe offshore or low tax jurisdictions can re-legitimize themselves? So the qualms that are had about IFCs are going to be put to the sword, or do you think those reputational concerns will continue regardless of these projects?
Well, many questions in one. I mean, first, I think what Jeff said is absolutely true, very nuanced, and that's right. The fact that low tax jurisdictions would implement or not, I think, doesn't matter that much to the countries implementing because they're going to grab the tax. So I'm not sure that there is any reputational impact. You don't implement Pillar 2, you're not a good guy because Pillar 2 was engineered in a way where you don't need the low tax jurisdictions to implement to have an impact, right? So it's not like by not implementing, you would jeopardize the mechanism itself. And that's why I think not implementing, deciding not to implement is not an issue. I wouldn't see this as an issue from the point of view of the policymakers who engineered that mechanism. So I would reverse the question and I would ask myself, if I were the BVI or another jurisdiction, what's best for me, putting aside the reputation because I think it's not impacted. Is it better that I have a windfall revenue, if not profit? It's a windfall revenue if I don't lose business, if it's taxed at 15% effective. Or is it better that I leave it to another country? Because there will be an effective taxation of 15. Will it be reduced a bit for cash boxes? And so the carve out doesn't do anything. And I'm not sure that whatever refundable tax credit countries could engineer or jurisdictions could engineer will make a big difference. So we'll probably move from an effective tax rate from 0 or 1 or 2% to something closer to 15%. So what do? Do you leave it to others to collect, or do you try to collect it yourself and use the money to improve the environment? And so I think that's the way to ask the question, more than what will they think of me if I don't move. And I agree with Jeff, if you do not have a traditional regular tax system because you're different, not because you're a weirdo, but because your economy is absolutely different, what do? Do you do a QDMTT? Do you try to put in place a corporate income tax? Jeff is right. The UAE was on the way to introduce corporate income tax because they want to move away from oil, or they know that at some point the dependence on oil is such as they will have to have domestic resource mobilization. So the circumstances in the Caribbean are very different than what they are for Singapore, from the UAE, or from other countries like that. So the real question is, what's the impact on existing business? And I noted what Kaila said, which is that there is a restructuring, rationalization. That doesn't mean that all the structures will be gone. So what's the impact of the minimum tax on the existing structure, and therefore on the revenue, and therefore on the use of that revenue for the existing, for the stock? What's going to be the impact on new business? And there, I think there is a real need for BVI Finance and other such organizations to look very carefully and deeply into the business, into the outlook, and try to adapt. But fundamentally, and sorry, I will say something, don't kill the messenger, even though I'm more than the messenger, I bear responsibility for part of that. But the goal, and I would strongly disagree and respectfully disagree with Mindy, I think is wrong saying, oh, there was no clear objective. I mean, sorry, there was an extremely clear objective, which was to stop tax competition and put a safety net at 15%. That was very articulated in all the leaders' speeches and mine. So if the objective is to do so, the impact for the cash boxes or for the entities which do not have much substance in terms of employees or physical assets, but which are mostly financial entities, the impact will be very significant, which means that for jurisdictions like the BVI, there is a real question which necessitates an in-depth reflection. And I would follow Jeff. I mean, being part, I mean, I noted the word participation. You're absolutely right. Participating to these bodies and being able to have your voice heard and these concerns heard about the future of the economy is something that needs to be taken into account.
And just on specifics then, I mean, you mentioned that obviously jurisdictions have the option to impose a QDMTT to stop this money just being left on the pavement for other countries to pick up. Do you think that's a realistic or preferred option that IFCs like BVI but others should be looking at? As Jeff said, the Crown dependencies are going to do that, but the pickup elsewhere is undetermined. Do you think it's a good idea?
I'm not sure there is a one-size-fits-all answer, frankly speaking. You have very different situations, circumstances. Bermuda, reinsurance business. What's the impact on reinsurance business? Are there other aspects of competitiveness for Bermuda, like the regulation or other stuff? So I don't know. Cayman, if I understand well, is a fund industry. The fund industry is exempt everywhere in the world, so Cayman may not be massively impacted. The BVI, if I'm not mistaken, is largely about incorporating businesses. When I left the OECD, there was, what, 450,000 companies incorporated in the BVI. It's in the Global Forum report. What's the impact of the minimum tax? To be looked at. What kind of businesses are incorporated? If you move south, you have Barbados. Barbados has a corporate income tax. It's extremely low in terms of effective taxation. What do you do there? And the business is slightly different. So my message is for the significant economies in the region, you really need to look into the facts. We didn't mention the Bahamas, but the Bahamas is consulting and seems to be willing to move into the direction of doing a QDMTT, even though, you know, it's another economy largely based on trusts and private wealth. And so no one size fits all, and the need to reflect seriously on the consequences of moving and also on the consequences of not moving. Again, you may, if you don't move, you may take the hit without taking the money. And if you take the money, at least you may master some ways of giving it back by improving the overall environment or by transitioning the economy. Last, because Jeff wants to come in, you also have, I mean, a critical mass in terms of the size of the economy. I don't know for Grenada, for Dominica, whether the size of the financial center is large enough to sustain the new transparent and regulated tax environment. That's a serious question, which I raised already 10 years ago with Christine Lagarde when she was at the IMF, the managing director, telling her this agenda is going to have an impact on these islands, and you should do something. The response was, well, we act only when there is distress, which is a bit of a pity, but it's a situation where I think the international community will have to deal with distress, and we haven't mentioned climate change. So over to Jeff.
Jeff.
Thank you, Oliver. I hope that's okay, just in terms of supplementary comments. So I agree with Pascal. It will be a jurisdiction by jurisdiction assessment. The level of participation and the solution you build will relate to your business footprint, how you earn your living in the world, and what the impact is. So if you've got very few companies in scope, you may not be too worried about the impact. If you've got a lot of companies in scope, then how far you go between participating through supporting UTPR, if people need information to exercise that, or going to IIR and actually having your own domestic top-up tax. A lot will depend how big the pot is that you're actually going to tax, and does that bring you new revenue? And as Pascal said, you know, if you're going to take the pain, you might as well have the money. But the reason I brought reputation in, Pascal, I'd be interested to know whether you agree with this or not, is when we've had other international standards, there is a bit of a pattern with the EU of following on with their equivalence considerations. And we've had it through the FATF, and in a number of countries have been grey listed from time to time. It causes a bit of hassle. The OECD, your former organization, will be quite concerned about how well CRS is implemented. And they'll be going out doing peer reviews and checking that people are doing what they said they would do. And if they don't, there'll be a bit of either bad publicity or a bit of some sort of sanction for that. So the reason I brought reputation into this, at least as a consideration, you know, if the OECD was the sole arbiter of how this is implemented and how it's judged, then I wouldn't be worried. But because the EU will take a view on that, and they've already passed a directive mandating implementation within the EU, if that becomes an equivalence criteria for listing purposes, then I think there could be a bit of reputational collateral damage. But I wouldn't expect you to comment on that too deeply, given your former role and the fact that you're in France, you live in France, and you work for a company that's based there. There we are.
If I may quickly react, you're absolutely right, Jeff. Sorry, I was too much still wearing an OECD hat. I think from an OECD perspective, the reputation, I don't see much of reputational risk, but you're absolutely right with the overall picture with the European Union. It's definitely something to take into account. So that's good advice. You're absolutely right, and I was misleading in my comment. And I would add that cooperation in terms of proper implementation, whether you implement or not a UTPR or QDMTT, but the fact that you supply the information, which by the way is a legal obligation under the tax treaties, which not only cover financial information, but all type of information, will be absolutely key. But you're right. I mean, you have a point on the European Union.
Mindy wants to come in.
Yeah, I did just want to follow up on some of the points that Kayla made, but I think it also goes to how should countries respond? How should BVI respond? You know, Kayla was saying that companies aren't moving or restructuring, but they are rationalizing. And I think that companies, I haven't spoken to a single company that has said that they're not taking a hard look at their overall structures, their holding company structures, their financing structures. And so I do think that's coming. I think there's some time that was bought with a safe harbor, for the information return safe harbor, that's so it's not going to happen immediately, but I do think every jurisdiction that serves a role within multinational structures of providing cash flow and tax benefits is going to need to, over the next year or two, take a hard look at what are the benefits they're providing and how they could continue to remain an attractive jurisdiction.
Great, thanks, Mindy. Just before we come back on that, maybe I could pose one final question to Pascal before he leaves. You mentioned the fact that funds are always and everywhere exempt from these provisions, and you also mentioned in regards to Bermuda the insurance treatment. So one question: is there any chance that either of those, the treatment of either of those centres, gets reviewed going forwards, or the bolts get tightened up? Because certainly with regards to funds, there seems to be an agreement on absolute exemption. Is that going to be, is that universally respected, or is there already a frisson of pressure to try to get that changed? And then I guess with regards to insurance, if I may editorialize here, I mean, insurance and particularly captives are really poorly treated in the rules for several reasons. regarding regulatory capital, regarding premium and the STTR, regarding the calculation of ETR because due to timing issues. Are either of those things, is there already pressure or likelihood they'd be reviewed, or is this going to be sort of set in stone once at least China, India, the US, etc. on board? Is it set in stone, or would that be relooked at going forwards potentially?
Yeah, very great questions. And I apologize to you all and to the audience that I need to leave in 5 minutes, so that maybe I will speak my point and leave you, and apologies for that. But I would need tea leaves to respond to your question. So I will give you my best guess, right? I do not see any change in the rules. I will bring a caveat to what I've just stated, but I don't see any change for the fund industry. I mean, unless you have a systemic change in the fund industry. I'm not a specialist, I don't know, but I don't see any change. The real, I mean, they are exempt everywhere, and that's why they're not in scope, because they are transparent, and I mean, we all know that. This changing, no, unless the whole economy of the fund industry changes, but I don't see this. Reinsurance is in the scope, and can it be carved out? No, because if you start carving out some sectors, you kill the thing. The only sector which was carved out is international shipping, for a very simple reason, which is if you do not have all the countries implementing, it's a question of leveling the playing field. It would be enough for Luxembourg or Liechtenstein or Andorra. I mentioned 3 countries well known for their ports, right? It would be enough of one of them not to implement for the whole industry to locate there. So you would need to level the playing field, all the countries, which was the case with the end of bank secrecy. Thus the reviews, the peer review, and the sanction for those not implementing. So that's why that's the only industry which was carved out. Now, the carve out of on what I've just said. The US is always different, and sometimes our American friends like Mindy forget that the US is also a country. So they think you have the US and you have servants all over the world, and the US doesn't fail to implement a commitment because they don't commit. I mean, they say something, it doesn't matter because Congress is not committed. So, and I didn't say the US failed, but Biden failed. He took the commitment and failed. And I think the Caribbean has enough, I mean, has suffered enough for the inability of the US to play as a fair country implementing the commitments. FATCA is a good illustration of that. Give me the stuff, I don't give you back what I'm asking from you. So if the US, which still has the largest economy in the world and the economic power, if the US passes a reform in 2 years' time, which revisits the global minimum tax, or which revisits Pillar 1, which I believe is something which may happen, then the rest of the world may need to adjust. So what I'm saying is the things are stabilized until a massive player like the US moves into that direction. But if there are some slight changes, maybe the rest of the world will adapt, which is the story of FATCA, right? FATCA happened, we made the CRS out of FATCA. And here it's more of a dialectical approach. You had guilty to start with, then you had the Pillar 2 and the income inclusion rule, UTPR and QDMTT. And maybe the next iteration would be another form, the Pillar 2 being revisited either by the Republicans, who are the inventors of the global minimum tax, or the Democrats in a variation of Pillar 2. It's more about what is a qualified tax credit more than the jurisdictional blending. I do not see sectorial exemption, because if you have a sectorial exemption, the whole thing collapses. But I wouldn't exclude that there would be some adjustments if or when the US moves. But the US, we should never forget about that, is a country like others, even though it's slightly bigger.
Pascal, thank you so much for your time. I don't know if you want to drop off now, if you have some final remarks, but it's been a pleasure to have you for the last
No,
hour.
final remark. Good luck. Thanks for the invitation. And it's an important conversation. which is critical for the economic future of jurisdictions. I do think that the move was ineluctable. It's been a travel of 15 years following the global financial crisis. Transparency is something which was needed to improve the fairness of the tax system. It has not killed populism and rejection of globalization, but it was necessary. Same for the regulation, international tax regulation of globalization, which is this global minimum tax, which will be something like Pillar 1 when it is implemented. So that was the right thing to do, but there is a cost, and a very serious cost for small open jurisdictions like the Caribbean jurisdictions. They probably overgained from globalization. It would not be fair that they lose everything, because you have real people living in these jurisdictions, and there should be mechanisms to compensate, to help these jurisdictions change their business models. And it starts with what do they do with the global minimum tax and its implementation, but it's much beyond this tax issue. It's almost an existential issue, and I believe there are answers, and people like you can help. So I wish you good luck. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Pascal.
Thank you. Great to see you.
We are going to continue, so keep questions coming in the Q&A box if you have any. I'm not sure if any of the rest of the panel want to come in on what Pascal just said, knowing that he can't defend himself now that he's left. Or if we want to proceed with, Mindy's come off mute. An indication that you want to come in.
I'll just say, I mean, I live in the United States. I was born in the United States, and I don't think the US thinks the rest of the world is perfect.
Don't American honor has been defended. So Kayla's come off mute there. American honor has been defended. Don't worry, Mindy. Kayla.
No, I was just going to suggest I could pick up one of the points that Mindy made, because I think it's very much the case that our jurisdictions need to carefully consider what that value proposition is if the tax component goes away. So we're not. This isn't a new concept. I think ever since FATCA and CRS came in, economic substance, the requirements related to tax transparency have caused us to rethink that value proposition. I think now is really time to do that carefully. And I also think it's picking up on what Pascal was saying. It goes way beyond tax, and it really requires our governments in each jurisdiction to come up with a government-wide strategy regarding long-term revenue generation and the overall strategic direction of each jurisdiction. And I think the fact that it's not mandatory at this point in time actually gives us a bit of flexibility and room to make sure that analysis is done completely and properly, and all of the administrative tasks and investment that would be required to implement any of these measures in a current no tax jurisdiction, compared on a cost benefit analysis with potential revenue, that's going to take some careful analysis. But in the meantime, thinking through that value proposition is quite important.
Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, if you'll allow me the luxury just to jump into the European-US debate. What I would say is very commendable in terms of the US approach, is that they were prepared to enter into a global minimum tax that potentially could cost the US exchequer a great deal of money. Out of the 100 companies or so in those in scope, the big American tech companies, which actually is where all this started to some degree, certainly in terms of Pillar 1. It was a reaction, wasn't it, to the perception that they're not paying enough tax in Europe on their sales and their market economies in other parts of the world. And I think Janet Yellen came forward. The previous administration wasn't too keen, but Janet Yellen came forward and volunteered a re-engagement with the concept of the global minimum tax, and I think was a fairly strong champion of it in the US. I think still is. So to balance the commentary a little bit, I think the US deserves some credit for that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's obviously it's been a bit of a circuitous way that we've got to where we are, but I think I certainly wouldn't characterize it as the US in any way having shaped this outcome that we've got to as being self-serving. I think the conversation, actually it's worth looking at if anyone's got some spare time to do it. The conversation that was had in the Tax Ways and Means Subcommittee actually explains about that from where we are, Mindy, and you'll correct me if I misrepresent your words, that the US has ended up with quite poor outcome in terms of its own tax outcomes and economic competitiveness, and the three sorts of, I guess, ways that it has out of it, none of them is perfect. So I wouldn't portray it as altruistic, but I also wouldn't portray it as being self-serving where we've got to on the US's part.
Yeah, I think, you know, someone's going to have to do a postmortem, but I think there was an unfortunate sequence of events that led the principle of a global minimum tax, which the US was again a first mover on, turning into something that is now documented as a significant enough revenue loser for the United States that members of Congress are rightly upset about it. And what that means for the future of the U.S. participation in the global regime and U.S. support for OECD, U.S. Congress support for OECD processes, I think remains to be seen.
Yeah. If you can, so one of the questions that's been posed by Richard Grasby, great questions from Team Appleby here, but he asked, do the panel think you'll see structures altered to avoid consolidation of profits hitting the 750 million euro threshold, particularly in the case of, I guess, family offices, family-owned and trustee-owned groups, to avoid falling in scope of that? Pascal would have been great to hear on this question, but I don't know if the panel have any views on whether that's a viable tax strategy, particularly when you have family structures.
So I'll just comment. I used to do a lot of M&A work, and you know what, you don't necessarily see a company or family waking up one day and saying we're going to split in two so that we get out of this. But what you do see is when decisions have to be made, that they're made taking into account the extent to which the decision would force a company into these rules or would allow it to escape them. And so it would come up in thinking about a new acquisition or in a sale of a business. And so you are likely to see that it's playing an important role in both family owned and public companies, I think.
Yeah, I certainly personally have seen that and think there's going to be, it's not going to be this big bang where when it comes in or is about to come in, there's going to be a reassessment because the restructuring costs are going to be so significant. But certainly when it comes to longer term, if you have the ability to unravel your substantive family business from financial assets separately, then that is a sensible thing to consider. And the same is true when there are acquisitions and mergers that might take over the threshold. There's a couple of questions that have been posed that are sort of entwined to an extent, both from anonymous participants. So one is regarding sort of low tax jurisdictions without large tax authorities. Should they effectively, by collaborating but not implementing in full the rules, effectively aren't they using their quite small budgets just to administer the tax codes of other countries and to assist tax collection in other countries? And I suppose the way that countries could avoid that is by having a QDMTT that, as discussed before, is very bureaucratically administrative burdensome. Which maybe brings on to the second question to the panel is, so another anonymous attendee said, should the Caribbean low or zero tax jurisdictions consider pooling their resources into a pan-Caribbean body that can assist with administration and collection of Pillar 2, if that might end up making it more viable for them to have QDMTTs or similar, so they're not leaving money left by the side of the road for other countries to pick up. Is that sort of collaboration the sort of thing we'd expect from low tax jurisdictions? Maybe it's best place to answer that.
I think it's probably unlikely. I mean, tax is a sovereign matter. So going federal implies some kind of stronger relationship between independent jurisdictions than might otherwise be the case. Coming together perhaps to interface with the OECD. I mean, there's a lot of tax capacity building offers, it seems to me, coming out of the OECD. That I think the outcome statement talked about the development of a handbook, tax handbook, to help administrations who are not familiar with managing these kinds of situations to build the necessary capacity. And I'm sure there would be offers of help with capacity building. But if jurisdictions were in similar circumstances, then some kind of collective interface with these sort of fora might be helpful. But internalizing and sharing the costs would, in a sense, mean they're opening each other's books to one another. I'm not sure that would be a very palatable prospect for tax administrations in the Caribbean. I'm not sure they'd be too keen to do that. So it's a well-motivated question, I think. You know, how can we manage and navigate through this in a less costly way? But I'm not sure that would be a solution that would get off the runway. Yeah.
Indeed.
You know, as we're here today, there's an event taking place in Cartagena in Colombia for a Latin American regional collaboration. And although it doesn't involve kind of splitting costs, I think it shows, I think it's illustrative of how different regions of the world are getting together and recognizing that they have shared interests, and that collaboration, as Jeff just said, might give them a stronger position at more global bodies. And so I think there is room for collaboration, even if it's not necessarily setting up a joint tax system.
Kayla.
Yeah, I agree with that point. And I guess going back to the first question around, you know, before you get to figuring out how you're actually going to make it happen, and if there's anything that can be done to ease that burden, the question around should these jurisdictions really be spending their limited budget on helping other jurisdictions collect their taxes, which, to be fair, is what's been happening for several years now. The ITA has spent a lot of resources on just sending information with no desire to receive it back, just to help other tax jurisdictions and be a good global tax citizen, if you may. But that's exactly the cost benefit analysis that I think does need to happen. And it shouldn't be looking at 1 year, it should be looking at quite a long-term solution, and taking into account all of the investment that would be required in terms of, we've already talked about it, but resources, you know, building that tax expertise locally, which we've never really needed at the government level, systems, tax treaties, taking all of that into consideration and balancing that with the potential revenue generation. And I do think that first needs to be done for each jurisdiction, because it's going to be a different answer for each jurisdiction, and then look for opportunities to collaborate, as both Mindy and Jeff mentioned.
So in terms of collaboration, certainly when it comes to presenting a public face, when it comes to interfacing with the EU and the OECD and other public policy makers around the world, I think it's fair to say that there's very few people in Brussels that can tell the difference between Bermuda, BVI, Bahamas, and Barbados. If you really put them on the spot, they'd just say that they're all the same. And one civil servant in the background might sort of go, oh, I can tell the difference, but it's very few and far between that can. So in terms of, I guess, collaboration, is it about public relations and public representation of the positions and justifying intellectual positions that's been adopted? That's the work that governments can do together. As Kayla, as you said, the governments are going to reach different conclusions for reasons that Jeff mentioned earlier: history, capacity, different business models, different geographic scope. Countries are going to reach, even IFCs with similar so public profiles are going to reach different outcomes based on what's best for them, and it will be different what's best for them based on those sectors. So is the work they should collaborate together on that, sort of having a public face to justify and defend tax neutrality generally, to defend funds being carved out generally, to defend 750 million euro threshold, because there's no guarantee that doesn't fall in future, of course. Is that the work that should be done?
Come on, if I may. So yeah, I think a degree of quiet collaboration goes on already. So, you know, those who go to the Global Forum meetings in Paris, those who participate in the Inclusive Framework, they do have a dialogue with each other. I think it's quite informal and perhaps sporadic, and maybe they could do something about formalizing that a little bit more. But I think it makes sense to try and work through the existing conduits, the existing international fora. And, you know, I think on financial crime, it's making sure you've got a voice and a presence at FATF, and that you're very proactive in engaging with one another about how you address things like listing. And indeed making sure, so far as you can, as a group of smaller jurisdictions, that there is fairness and equity in the process. You know, I think it's most unlikely, I don't want to be particularly political, it's not a political point, but it's most unlikely that France or the United Kingdom or the United States would ever get listed. I don't think it would matter what their performance was like. So in a sense there's an inbuilt sort of slope on the level playing field. So if jurisdictions can collaborate around that kind of thing and taxation and the development of taxation policy, then I think that's a good thing. I mean, the African countries, I think partly egged on by some NGOs promising them a pretty unrealistic crock of gold at the end of the rainbow, are keen to take international tax policy to the UN. And I think that's a bit of a cul-de-sac potentially for people who are going to get sort of trapped down. So you know, I think a measure of collaboration makes a lot of sense, but at the end of the day, you know, Bermuda is a very different jurisdiction to the BVI and to Barbados, as you quite rightly pointed out, and you'll probably want different outcomes and different things. So collaboration to a point at a generic level and trying to make sure as a collective you dealt with fairly through the international fora, I think there's a lot of mileage. When it gets down to your detailed response to something like this, I do think it is jurisdiction by jurisdiction.
Kayla, did you want to come in on that?
Only to say I agree. I agree with what Jeff said. No, nothing further on that one.
Fantastic. And there's also a question about whether, it was posed earlier by Jeff, is whether effectively minimum tax gets written into, hardwired into other regulatory initiatives. There have been some suggestions that it be added as a criterion for the EU tax blacklist. Do we think that's a likelihood? Obviously, none of us are policymakers, but would that be in keeping with the rest of the project thus far? Kayla.
In my view, I don't think you can rule it out. And that's why I think there's been lots of surprises over the years on that front, which is just another point for it's regardless of whether you take action now, it's important to complete the analysis now and to have an idea of what your options are, so that if that something like that does happen, or if the threshold drops, so that more entities are in scope, for example, you can't just wait until that happens. I think it needs to start now so that you're aware of your options and you can be flexible in the future. Unfortunately, I don't think we can say it won't be picked up by the EU.
Yeah, certainly in the first instance, the only reason that economic substance was added as a criterion for 2.2 jurisdictions is because the EU initially wanted to have a minimum statutory rate of tax required of third countries, and the UK, which of course was an EU member state at the time, vetoed it. And if it hadn't been for that, there would have been a minimum tax. It wouldn't have been a minimum effective tax rate the EU was expecting of countries around the world, but it would have been a minimum statutory tax rate, which obviously would have affected BVI. So certainly there's pressure, but I think that, as Pascal said, there is an act of altruism, might not be the right word, but if BVI chooses not to implement IIR, if other countries choose not to implement an IIR, that is ceding their tax base and taxing rights to another country, effectively. And so as a consequence, it's not something that instinctively you would think that even France or Spain or Italy, the countries that are really usually quite bullish on these things in the EU would want to penalize, right? But on the other hand, I suppose that the EU is only a very minor part of what BVI clients are concerned. I think about 9% of ultimate beneficial owners of BVI companies are EU based, which is a minor factor. I mean, if I ask the panel, I put to the panel, what happens if China remains a holdout? What happens if Latin America remains a holdout? What happens if Sub-Saharan Africa remains a holdout? Does that change the calculation for jurisdictions like BVI that I guess lean more in that direction than some other centres? And do you see that being a realistic possibility politically, diplomatically, geopolitically?
Well, I'll comment on China because I've written a lot about it, and it was also a topic, as you might imagine, at the Ways and Means Committee meeting. I think China has not, to my knowledge, has not made any public comments about the extent to which it will adopt Pillar 2 or Pillar 1. I think there's really complex questions about, even if it does adopt, what that means in terms of the number of large Chinese multinationals that are not considered Chinese companies, but are headquartered in low tax jurisdictions. So I think there's a very complicated interaction there with the enormous incentives China offers to its domestic and to spur domestic innovation. So China and what that means if China doesn't adopt, I'm not sure for the larger picture. It's not clear to me that any other country could enforce a UTPR against Chinese companies, and how the OECD would go about monitoring, even if China does adopt the rules into law, how someone would go about monitoring that. And so if you, as a jurisdiction, want to place all your eggs in the China basket or the Latin American basket, maybe that's not the worst place to be over the long term, but to the extent that you want to continue to rely heavily on EU and US investment, I think you probably want to pay close attention to the development of these rules.
Jeff.
Yeah, I would say a big factor there is, I mean, interestingly, China is on the list of the 138 countries that just approved the outcome statement that went to the G20. So they're saying, at least publicly, that they're supporting the program. Whether they'll, adopt an IRR and a domestic tax, I don't know. Whether there will be obstructive in others trying to collect tax from them, I don't know. But I don't think they want to be an outlier in the international community and thumb their nose at global standards. Indeed, I think they feel they should be influencing global standards much more and have a bigger voice and a bigger say. I think if you did sort of take the view as a smaller jurisdiction, well, China's not too bothered, so we'll throw a lot in with them. And all those jurisdictions are just not going to play with this, and maybe the people who have got the strength of feeling behind this aren't so important to us. The problem with that is the global payment system is incredibly dependent on the dollar, and if you decide that you're going to pull away from the international payment system, you're going to pull away from the dollar. And I imagine that much of the value in BVI companies, and many, this also includes Jersey, much of the value that we're administering is actually dollar-based. So I think it's not a simple calculation. There's a huge amount of risk in it. And then the other thing I think is, if you need to be a fully functioning finance center in the cross-border business, whether it's incorporating companies that operate internationally or whether it's facilitating cross-border payments, investments, etc. You really need to have the capability to continue to operate cross-border. If you get out of line with international standards, I think the banking community, which are a critical component of all of that, would become quite uncomfortable working in your particular location. So, you've got to think about not just yourself, but the architecture and the infrastructure that you need to operate and who owns it. And in that respect, I think that would be personally, that'd be quite a high-risk strategy if people were to pursue that. So I think when you're part of the little guys group, you've got to try and be friends with everybody if you can. That sounds a difficult thing to achieve, but I think it's the safest place to be.
Kayla.
Yeah, I think I would agree in terms of future business, and it's risky to start to pull away from those jurisdictions that are implementing. But in terms of assessing the current companies and structures in the BVI, first of all, I think there's a bit of a misconception that there's very few BVI headquartered M&E groups that meet the threshold, which we've seen through CBCR is actually not the case. They may just not be the big names that we recognize in the newspapers. But in terms of the government and companies assessing the current structures here, a lot of those may only be BVI China or BVI Latin America structures. So again, if the government's considering implementing something, if they go down the route of implementing something and then a majority of structures actually don't come into scope anyway, you know, that all needs to be factored in. So I think there's an element of assessing the current business in the BVI, and then certainly to Jeff's point, that doesn't necessarily mean we should be changing a strategy of what to target in the future. But the current structures, there's quite a lot of China and Latin America, as we know.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning the fact that, as was mentioned earlier, Bahamas does have a green paper out consulting on changes to their tax reforms, and amongst the 4 options, so one of them is introduce an IIR along the lines of the OECD model, but 3 of the other options go further than that and would introduce a generally applicable corporate income tax rate with the turnover or profit threshold varying amongst the 3 other options. And in the UAE, which was mentioned earlier discussed by Pascal, there is the proposal for there is now 9% federal income tax there, which is not in alignment with the OECD proposal, but is a generally applicable income tax. Now, obviously, Dubai IFC and similar are exempt from it, but you now see IFCs adopting generally applicable income taxes on internationally mobile companies. And I want maybe this might be the last question, so maybe a happy answer would be good. But is there a prospect of that being the solution that places like BVA or other OTs and CDs reach for, or is it likely to be adherence to the OECD model and no further in terms of creating new taxes?
Well, I'll chip in on that to start with, if you don't mind. I think we've got to remember at the end of the day that we broadly built our success on being 0 low tax jurisdictions, not with the aim of eating somebody else's lunch, but to try and facilitate cross-border activity with as low a cost overhead as possible, and leave the taxing rights with the country where conventionally a company is headquartered. And in more recent years, the transparency measures have made sure that those tax administrations that have that legitimate relationship and have that legitimate taxing right have the necessary information independently of the company to tax at the correct level. That's the fundamental model of tax neutral pooling, investment pooling, or even companies trading cross-border. So if that's our core offer and our point of difference, because those things are very hard to create in a large onshore economy where you've got a very heavy tax burden, you can't afford to operate your system in that way. And if you attempt to on a sort of a carve-out basis, then you get accused of state aid and similar measures very quickly. It's a point of difference that gives a customer proposition that's kind of differentiated, not exactly unique because there's a collective doing it, but not a large number of countries. And that's our point of difference. That's how we earn our business. And as long as we're doing that legitimately, we're not handling the proceeds of crime, we're helping businesses flourish and prosper around the world. We take a small administration charge and then we tax the profits on that. And we just let that capital flow back and forth from the source country to the destination country and back again. And that tax authorities in those appropriate parties, the source country and the destination country, both have a bite at the cake for tax. Then I think we've got a very transparent and compelling offer that big countries find it very hard to emulate. So starting to go down the track of going further around taxing ourselves, introducing more taxation or higher taxation, I think is unhelpful to the longevity of that proposition. And I'm not sure why companies would tolerate higher and higher tax burdens in a jurisdiction like ours, where we're simply administering things for them principally. And it's those companies that are creating the value in the destination investment countries and repatriating those profits home to be taxed as appropriate. So I would think conceptually and propositionally, it's not a good route to go down.
I'll just add one quick point there that it's not a model that many other countries are pursuing. Most of the countries that you see that have announced plans to implement are proposing to do it on a very limited basis for companies that are within scope.
Kayla.
I might just add my understanding. I'd have to go to my Bahamas colleagues for the full picture, but my understanding is Pillar 2 actually has just fit in nicely with evolving plans that have been kind of bubbling away in Bahamas for quite some time. So I think they've been contemplating a reform to the tax strategy even pre-Pillar 2. So there's more to the story. They implemented VAT, so it's a different scenario than potentially in the BVI. So it's interesting to see what's happening in each of these jurisdictions, because there's definitely crossover, but we come back to the point that each jurisdiction is in quite a nuanced position.
We've just had a slew of questions. I'm going to be dragged off the stage by Kane when it's appropriate. So BVI Finance team, do cut me off when I need to. We had a question from Rory Bork saying, what sort of timetable do you envisage for BVI to make decisions about its approach to Pillar 2? Of course, the CDs announced their joint approach a couple of months ago. But broadly, when would decision public announcement be likely, in your opinions? Maybe Kayla, being in BVI first. Don't know if you have any insight.
Yeah, I mean, it's the key question out there, isn't it? But I think for BVI, the default will be not implementing anything and complying with the exchange of information until the dust settles with the rest of the jurisdictions. I don't think there's any likelihood or really incentive for BVI to take a different approach publicly, and that's speaking on behalf of myself, not on behalf of the ITA and the government. So I personally wouldn't expect that to be taken publicly anytime soon. I mean, we see 20 some countries implementing in 2024, some 2025, some 2026. So there's still quite a bit of time to let the dust settle before taking an approach. I think the more important piece is what happens in the background in terms of the analysis and understanding what the options are. But I'm not expecting any public announcements soon, I'd say.
Jeff.
Yeah, so I would say what Kayla said is critical. It's the business impact assessment, isn't it? The first thing you need to do is figure out how many entities you've got in scope and what's involved. So if you did decide to levy tax yourself, what's the tax take versus the cost of implementing it? And if you have to build capacity and expertise that you don't currently have, and you've got the challenge of finding talent, you have to have IT systems, you've got to have, because you'll get checked on this. If you introduce it, I'm sure it'll become a peer review item in time. So you've got to do it really well and properly. And it's almost a math, isn't it? Of, is that investment worth the return? And you've got to think about displacement. So if we did that, would some companies think, well, it's marginal, the benefit is being there now, do we need to be there? So shall we close some of these companies, or shall we relocate them somewhere else? So I think you can't move forward in this without doing some kind of impact assessment, and that will inform your thinking, I think, primarily. I think the reason the CDs have actually issued a joint statement saying this is directionally their intention is because they've done those impact assessments. They've gone out to industry and they've asked for indications on corporates managed and administered, and tried to do some kind of scoping exercise on who is in scope and who's out of scope. And they must have decided, I presume, we're not privy to it, but I must assume they've decided on balance it's actually worth doing from their point of view, and they're going to collect some new taxation on that, and at the same time project that they're on board with, because they are, with the international standard that's being developed for global minimum taxation. So for them, I think it works, but it's not a one-size-fits-all. I think as a jurisdiction, the first thing you would have to do is do that assessment, and then figure out the dynamics for your clients, the political damage or gain, and where you end up financially.
Yep. And one other question in the Q&A box is why are the CDs going down the QDMTT route? The only difference seems to be capacity, and I think that's my view. I mean, the reason why the CDs can comfortably do it is they already have corporate income tax systems. The rate is 0% for many of the relevant taxpayers that we talk about, but they already have corporate tax systems. They have much larger administrations and ability to deal with the paperwork, to exchange information, as well as having more EU and UK facing business. So the consequences of not doing QDMTT would be higher. Jeff is nodding along, so I'm going to assume that I don't need to be corrected on that, which I'm always delighted by. I'm not sure of any other questions. Does anyone have any maybe final remarks from the panel on the direction the world is going in, or the direction the IFC should be going in? If anyone wants any impact assessments, I'm sure Kate will be delighted that her colleagues in Bahamas were the ones that did the impact assessment for the green paper. But sorry, Mindy.
I think that it's important, it's easy to get caught up in a negative narrative here, but I think it's important to look at the opportunities it provides for rethinking historical ways of attracting investment and doing business, and thinking about the chance to do a reboot and make oneself an even more attractive jurisdiction.
Yep. Jeff.
I'd concur that, and I think that my final sort of parting shot would be, although the Crown Dependencies have announced they're going to go down this route, they've also said they'll continue to monitor international developments. So you could never say never, and that's I think the world that IFCs live in now. You have to be constantly monitoring international developments, geopolitical developments, kind of keep up with the international standards program, but constantly figure out, reflect on, does this work for us? Because all the big countries do that. They're driven by economic self-interest. So why shouldn't smaller countries be as well?
And the last word from Kayla.
Yeah, I guess my parting thought would be, obviously a lot of the burden is going to fall on the IT and the government to complete this analysis, but we as the industry can also assist with that. We have lots of information on our clients that we can pull together and actually make sure that the analysis that is being done is accurate, and pool our resources in that state to the extent possible. I think we also have an important role to play here.
Great, thank you very much to Jeff, Mindy, Kayla, Pascal, and all the audience. And I'm going to hand back to Adriana, I think.
Thank you, Oliver. In fact, I'm aware that the government has already started to do some assessments with ITA, so I'm sure they'll provide any updates on how that's going as well. And we can conclude that it's not a one size fits all, and we all have individual assessments to move forward. Again, I would like to thank everyone, our audience / participants, for actively sending your questions forward and engaging in this discussion. Also our expert moderator, Oliver, and our expert panelists from Pascal, who had to leave a little bit earlier, Professor Mindy, Jeff, and Kayla. Kayla, which I didn't even mention earlier, that you're also a BVI Finance board member.
Yeah, that's right.
So she'll have a direct input on any of those updates, especially concerning this topic. Again, superb job by everyone on discussing the status of the global implementation of the OECD's Global Minimum Tax, Pillar 2, and the impact that it will have on business. For more information on this topic, the Tax and Times Roundtable discussions, and BVI Finance persons can visit our website at www.bvifinance.vg. You can also follow us on our socials for updates and information on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. BVI Finance at BVI Finance. Again, thank you all. Until next time, you can check out our website for follow-up. Thank you again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.